The last cornfield in Mahaska County didn't sleep in October. It breathed. The stalks had long since gone dry and brittle, their leaves curling inward like the fingers of an old man's fist. And when the wind moved through them after midnight, they produced a sound that was less rustling and more whispering, a low, papery hiss that carried across 500 acres of flat Iowa ground and settled into the bones of anyone standing still enough to hear it. Cora Ward had been standing still enough to hear it her entire life. She was 19 years old and she had never lived anywhere else. Not a single night. The Ward farm sat 11 miles south of Oskaloosa on a county road that most GPS systems didn't bother to name a long rectangle of black soil and harvested fields that her grandfather had broken with a borrowed tractor in 1951, and her father had nearly broken himself trying to hold on to ever since. The farmhouse at the center of it was white once, now the color of old cream, with a wraparound porch that leaned slightly to the left and windows that fogged on the inside every time the temperature dropped below 40. It was the most beautiful place Cora had ever seen. It was also slowly killing her father. She knew the numbers the way she knew the topography of every field, not from studying them, but from absorbing them through proximity, through years of sitting at the kitchen table while Harlan Ward spread bank statements across the oilcloth and pressed his fingers against his eyes. The mortgage was 14 years old. The interest had compounded in the bad years, the drought years, the years when the corn came up thin and the price per bushel dropped so low that running the combine cost more than the harvest was worth. There were liens on the equipment. There was a second notice from First Agricultural Bank of Iowa sitting on the counter that Harlan had turned face down and hadn't touched in 3 days. Cora had turned it face up that morning and read every word. She didn't tell her father. There was nothing to tell him that he didn't already know. Instead, she had gone out at 7 in the morning, and she had worked until the sun went sideways and orange across the western fields. And then she had kept working after that because the irrigation pump on the eastern boundary line had been throwing a fault code for 2 weeks, and if it seized before spring, they would lose the planting schedule on 200 acres. And losing the planting schedule on 200 acres was the kind of problem that didn't have a solution that fit inside the family's remaining margin. That was the mathematics of the Ward farm in the 14th year of the mortgage. Everything connected to everything else by threads of consequence that Cora had learned to trace before she learned to drive. A seized pump meant a failed planting. A failed planting meant a short harvest. A short harvest meant another year of compounding interest in another letter from First Agricultural Bank of Iowa. This one face up on the counter instead of face down. And after that, the letters stopped being letters and started being something else entirely. She had not told her father she had read the notice, but she had gone out at 7 and she had not come back in. So at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night in late October, Cora Ward was crouched in the dirt beside a rusted irrigation pump, housing at the edge of the property, her hands black with grease to the elbows, a work light clipped to the side of the housing. Throwing a pale yellow cone across the valve assembly, she was trying to coax back into alignment. The temperature had dropped into the low 40s. She could see her breath. She wore her father's old canvas work jacket, the one with the torn left pocket she had sewn back twice already, and her hair was pulled back under a knit cap that had been her mother's. Her mother had been gone for 4 years now. The hat still smelled faintly of the cedar closet where it had lived for most of Cora's childhood, and on cold nights working alone in the dark, she sometimes pressed the cuff of it against her nose without quite deciding to. She had the valve assembly nearly seated when the night broke open. It didn't start as a sound. It started as a feeling, a vibration in the ground beneath her knees, a low-frequency tremor that came from the direction of County Road 9, which ran along the northern boundary of the Ward property in a straight gravel line that connected nothing important to nothing else important and saw perhaps a dozen vehicles on a busy day. Then the sound arrived. A tire blowing out at speed produced a distinct report, not the sharp crack of a gunshot, but something heavier and more final. A concussive bark followed immediately by the mechanical shriek of a vehicle losing control of its own momentum. The gravel scattered. Metal found the earth with a sound that Cora felt in her back teeth. She killed the work light. She held absolutely still in the sudden darkness and listened. The cornfield was close behind her, the stalks beginning less than 30 feet from where she crouched. In front of her, across a shallow drainage ditch and a narrow strip of weedy ground, was the county road. She could see it faintly by the ambient light of a half moon, a pale gray line running east to west, and there, tilted at a hard angle into the ditch on the far side, sat a dark blue Lincoln Town car, with its headlights still burning the right front corner, buried in the soft embankment. The blown tire sitting flat and ragged against the gravel. The engine was still running. Cora didn't move. She stayed low, stayed still, and she watched. The driver's door opened first. A heavy man in a dark leather jacket climbed out. Not heavy the way farmers were heavy. Heavy the way men who spent time in confined, dangerous spaces were heavy, layered, and deliberate, with a quality of controlled energy that Cora registered somewhere below conscious thought as a warning. He moved to the rear of the car with his right hand already inside his jacket. The passenger door opened. A taller man, wire-thin, with a way of moving that reminded Cora of something predatory and patient. He went straight to the trunk. The trunk opened. What came out of it was a woman. She was older, Cora could see that much in the headlight wash, with silver hair that had come loose from whatever it had been pinned into and was now wild around her face. Her hands were behind her back. There was tape across her mouth. The tall man had her by the arm, and he was pulling hard, and she was making him work for every inch of it, because even bound and taped and dragged out of the trunk of a car at 11 o'clock at night on a road in the middle of Iowa, this woman was fighting. Her boots connected with the tall man's shin hard enough that Cora heard him curse from 50 yards away. The heavy man came around the rear of the car. He had the revolver out now, a heavy silver thing that caught the moonlight. He was scanning the road in both directions with the focused, unhurried efficiency of someone who had done this before and was not particularly worried about being seen. "Keep her still," he said, his voice carried in the flat October air. "Backup's coming. We just need to hold another 5 minutes." Cora's mind ran the math without being asked. There was no cell signal out here. The nearest cell tower was 3 miles east, and this low ground blocked it completely. She had learned that her first week of working the boundary line alone, when she had tried to call her father about a broken fence post, and the phone had shown nothing but dead air. The farmhouse was a mile and a half south across open fields. By the time she reached it, called for help, and help traveled the county roads back to this location, the backup vehicle would be here and gone, and that woman in the gravel would have vanished into whatever darkness these men were carrying her toward. 5 minutes. Cora looked at the woman in the gravel. The woman had stopped struggling for a moment, not from surrender, but from assessment. Her head up, her eyes moving the way an animal stops thrashing and starts calculating. There was an intelligence in that pause that Cora recognized even from 50 yards away, even in the thin moonlight. This was not a woman who had given up. This was a woman who was waiting for the right opening. The heavy man struck her across the face with his open hand. She went down onto the gravel. Cora picked up her pipe wrench. She had worked this land for 19 years. She knew every drainage ditch, every washed-out tire rut, every gap in the field rows where the planter had skipped and left a narrow corridor through the corn. She knew where the ground was soft and where it was firm and where it would hold weight without making sound. She knew this land the way she knew her own body, not by thinking about it, but by having lived inside it long enough that the knowledge had become something closer to instinct. She moved into the corn. The dry stalks closed around her, and she navigated by memory alone, working north and east in a wide arc that would bring her out behind the two men rather than in front of them. She moved carefully, not slowly, but with the deliberateness of someone who understood that silence in a dry cornfield was not a matter of trying, but of technique. Wait on the heel first. Let the foot find solid ground before transferring pressure. Keep the pipe wrench close to her body so it didn't swing. 19 years of walking these rows in the dark. She didn't need the light. She needed only to remember, and the land remembered for her. She came out of the corn 6 feet behind the heavy man. He had his back to her. He was watching the road to the east, the direction the backup vehicle would come from. The tall man had the bound woman up on her knees now, one hand fisted in her silver hair. Cora didn't think. Thinking would have stopped her. She swung the pipe wrench in a low hard arc, targeting the back of the heavy man's knee with every pound of farm-built muscle she had behind it. The sound it made was a dense structural crack, the sound of something load-bearing giving way, and the heavy man went down instantly, folding at the knee in the wrong direction, the revolver hitting the gravel with a sound like a stone dropped in water. The tall man spun. He was fast, faster than she expected. His hand went inside his jacket and Cora was already moving, closing the distance between them. Not with technique, but with pure forward momentum, dropping her shoulder and driving it into the center of his chest. The way her father had taught her to hit a fence post with a tamping bar. Commit the whole body, don't hold anything in reserve. They went over the embankment together. The slope was steep and covered in late-season blackberry cane, and they crashed through it in a tangle, Cora taking thorns across her left forearm, and the tall man losing his footing entirely and rolling hard into the muddy floor of the drainage ditch. She scrambled upright. First, her boots found solid ground, and she grabbed a fistful of the dry, loose soil from the embankment lip and threw it directly into his face. He screamed, not in pain and surprise and temporary blindness clawing at his eyes, thrashing sideways in the ditch mud. Cora was back up the embankment in 4 steps. The heavy man was trying to drag himself toward the revolver with one arm, his shattered knee useless beneath him, his breathing coming in wet, ragged pulls. Cora crossed to the gun first, picked it up, and kicked it in a long, flat arc into the cornfield. It disappeared into the rows without a sound. She went to the woman. "Can you stand?" she said. It wasn't quite a question. There was no time for questions. The woman looked up at her from the gravel. The tape was across her mouth, and her hands were still bound behind her back, and there was blood on her cheekbone from where she had gone down, but her eyes were completely clear and completely still, the eyes of someone who had not panicked and was not going to. She got her feet under her. Cora took her arm and they moved, not running, because running in the dark on uncertain ground with a bound woman was how someone broke an ankle, but moving with purpose, crossing the gravel shoulder and stepping down into the shallow ditch on the near side, and then up into the weedy strip and into the corn. Behind them on the road, a set of headlights appeared on the eastern horizon. Cora pulled them deeper into the rows. The corn closed around them, and they were gone. She navigated back to the ATV by feel and memory, moving in a diagonal line that kept them parallel to the road without approaching it. Twice the woman stumbled on uneven ground, and both times Cora had her arm and didn't let her fall. The headlights from the backup vehicle swept briefly across the top of the corn above them, a pale wash of light that showed nothing but dry tassels and open sky. And then the vehicle was passed and the darkness settled back in. They reached the ATV in the small clearing Cora used as a staging area for the boundary line work. She set the woman down against the rear wheel and pulled her hunting knife from the sheath on her belt. One cut through each zip tie. The plastic fell away. The woman brought her arms forward with a slow and careful deliberateness that suggested the joints were stiff and had been bound for some time. She peeled the tape from her own mouth, a slow and controlled movement, and she folded it once and set it on the fender of the ATV as if disposing of it neatly was simply the correct thing to do. Then she looked at Cora, not the way people looked at each other after something frightening had happened. Not with the wide, flooding eyes of shock or the trembling lower lip of relief. She looked at Cora the way someone looks at a piece of machinery that has just performed unexpectedly well, with assessment, with recalibration, with something that might have been the early stage of respect. "Start the engine," she said. Her voice was low and steady and rough with age and something that had nothing to do with fear. "The men who hired those two will burn this county looking for me before sunrise." Cora started the engine. The ride back to the farmhouse was a mile and a half of frozen dark. Cora killed the ATV's running lights after the first 100 yards and drove by moonlight, keeping to the low ground along the field edges where the shadow was deepest. The woman on the seat behind her held on without comment and didn't ask where they were going. The back door of the Ward farmhouse opened before Cora had the ATV fully stopped. Harlan Ward stood in the doorway with his 12 gauge at his side, not raised but present, The way a man who has spent time in places where weapons were necessary holds a weapon when he isn't sure yet if this is one of those times. He was 54 years old, and he carried it in his posture, the military service, in the way he occupied space in a doorway. He had done a year in the Gulf in 1991, and he had come back from it with a quality of stillness that his daughter had grown up reading the way other children read weather. Right now, the stillness had tension in it. Cora, his voice was flat and controlled. What happened? County Road 9, she said, coming through the door. Two men. She was in the trunk. They said something about a cartel and a backup vehicle. She said it quickly because there wasn't time to say it any other way. Harlan's eyes moved past her to the woman tracking the silver hair and the blood on her cheekbone, and the loose, undefeated quality of her posture, and his jaw set. Sit down, he said to the woman, not unkindly. I'll stand, she said. For the moment. Harlan went to the sink and ran a cloth under cold water. I'm calling Sheriff Pruitt, he said, reaching for the wall phone with his free hand. No. The woman's hand came out and closed around Harlan's wrist before he reached the receiver. Her grip was not the grip of a woman in distress. It was the grip of someone accustomed to stopping things from happening. You don't call local law, she said. The men who took me knew exactly where I was going to be tonight. They knew the road I would take and the time I would take it. That information came from inside a very small circle. She held Harlan's eyes. Your sheriff may be a fine man. He may not. Right now, we cannot afford to find out which. Harlan looked at his daughter. Cora nodded once. He put the phone back on the hook. The woman accepted the wet cloth and pressed it to her cheekbone with a matter-of-fact efficiency. She looked around the kitchen, the cracked linoleum, the old percolator on the counter, the stack of mail that included the banknote as Cora had turned face up that morning, and whatever she saw in the room seemed to settle something in her. My name is Vera Calloway, she said. She reached inside the torn leather vest she wore under a road-worn canvas jacket and removed something from an interior pocket. She set it on the kitchen table. It was a ring. Heavy silver, the band thick and worn smooth with years of wearing. The face of it bore an image that Cora recognized from the kind of documentaries her father watched on Sunday afternoons. A winged skull wearing a motorcycle helmet, the lines of it sharp and absolute. The death's head. Harlan Ward had grown up in rural Iowa in the 1970s and 1980s, and he had never been a man who frightened easily. But something moved across his face when he looked at that ring. Not fear exactly, but a recalibration. The look of a man who has just understood that the situation he is standing in is considerably larger than the situation he thought he was standing in. Cave Creek Charter, Vera said quietly, sliding the ring onto her finger. Out of Arizona. I'm up here visiting my sister's grave. She passed 2 years ago. I come every October. She looked at the ring on her finger. The people who matter call me Ma. The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the dry stalks of the nearest field, and the farmhouse settled around them with the slow wooden sound of old structures finding their balance in the cold. They'll track your footprints back to this road, Harlan said, and then they'll track the ATV from the road to here. Yes, Vera said. They will. Then we can't stay. We need to stay. She looked at Harlan with the calm authority of someone who has navigated worse rooms than this one. I need your phone. I'm going to make one call. After that, nobody is going to touch this house or anyone in it. Harlan looked at his daughter again. Cora was watching the woman. She had been watching her since the drainage ditch, cataloging the quality of her stillness, the precision of her movements, the way she had folded that strip of tape on the ATV fender. There was a kind of person who moved through crisis not by fighting the terrain, but by knowing it so completely that the path was never in question. Cora's father was one of those people. She had spent her life trying to become one. This woman was another. Give her the phone, Cora said. Harlan handed over the receiver. Vera dialed from memory. A long-distance number, no hesitation, the digits coming out of her fingers with the automatic certainty of something that had been dialed 10,000 times. The line rang twice. Someone picked up. Colt, Vera said. Her voice on the phone was different than it had been in the kitchen. It was quieter. It was the voice she used for someone she didn't need to perform steadiness for. "It's Ma. I'm in Iowa. Two cartel runners tried to put me in a box on County Road 9. A pause. "I'm safe. I'm at the Ward Farm south of Oskaloosa. A farm girl pulled me out of the trunk." Another pause shorter. "See you at first light, my boy." She hung up. She handed the receiver back to Harlan. "Who is Colt?" he said. "My son," she said. "He's the president of the Midwest faction." She looked at them both. "He's bringing some friends." Harlan Ward had spent a year in the Gulf of Persia, watching logistics materialize out of nothing, at the command of people who understood the difference between force and the credible promise of force. And he understood without needing more explanation than that, what some friends meant in the context of a woman who wore a winged skull on her finger and had a son who ran the Midwest faction of the largest outlaw motorcycle club in the country. He set his 12 gauge against the wall, went to the cupboard, and put the percolator on. "All right," he said, "we wait." What followed was the longest night Cora Ward could remember, and she had lived through some long ones the night her mother's fever spiked, and the ambulance took 40 minutes to arrive on these county roads the night 3 years ago, when a late frost killed every inch of the early planting, and her father sat at the same kitchen table until dawn doing arithmetic that only came out one way, no matter how many times he ran it. This was longer than those. She and Harlan sat in the darkened living room, the lights off, to deny anyone on the road a visible target, the shotgun and Cora's hunting rifle leaning against the wall between them. Every set of headlights that swept across the front windows from the county road made Cora's hands close on the armrests of her chair. Every shift in the wind made Harlan tilt his head toward the sound. Vera Calloway slept on the sofa. Not a restless half-sleep, not the fitful unconsciousness of someone in shock. A real deep, even-breathing sleep, her canvas jacket pulled across her chest, her hands folded on her sternum, her face composed and still. Cora watched her for a long time in the dark, and the more she watched, the less strange it seemed, because she began to understand that this was what genuine experience looked like. Not the absence of fear, the presence of so much accumulated history with danger that the body had learned to rest when rest was available, because there was no way to know when the next chance would come. Her father was the same way. He could sleep on a cot in a room full of noise. He had told her once when she was 12 that it was the most valuable thing the military had taught him. She hadn't understood it then. She was starting to understand it now. Around 3 in the morning, a set of headlights appeared on the county road and slowed near the northern boundary. Cora and Harlan both went still. The light sat there for perhaps 45 seconds, long enough for Cora's pulse to climb into her throat, and then they moved on. She exhaled. Harlan didn't. He stayed at the window for another 10 minutes, watching the empty road, and then he came back to his chair and sat down without saying anything. And Cora understood that he was doing the same arithmetic she was doing, running the same calculations about exposure and probability and the vulnerability of a farmhouse on a named county road with a single access drive. She thought about the bank notice on the counter. She thought about the pump she still hadn't finished fixing. She thought about the woman asleep on their sofa and the phone call that had gone south to a man named Colt, who was the president of the Midwest faction of the Hells Angels, and was, as of approximately 11:30 this evening, coming to her family's farm with some friends. At 5:30, the first pale gray light began to show on the eastern horizon, coming up slowly behind the black line of the tree line, like something cautious and uncertain of its welcome. The fields emerged from the dark in degrees, first the nearest rows, then the middle distance, then the full flat reach of harvested ground that ran to the fence line and beyond. Cora stood on the front porch in the cold. Her breath made small clouds. She was trying to decide whether the worst of it was over or whether it was still coming when the ground told her the answer. It started in the soles of her feet, a vibration, low and rhythmic and continuous, like a subsonic engine that had been running somewhere very far away and was getting closer at a rate that her body registered before her ears did. She pressed her palm flat against the porch railing and felt it there too, a trembling that had nothing to do with wind or traffic or any sound this county road had ever produced. The coffee mugs on the kitchen counter behind her began to rattle softly against each other. The water in the dog's dish rippled in small concentric rings, and then the sound arrived. It came from the north and the east simultaneously, which meant it was coming from the county roads in both directions, channeled and concentrated by the flat terrain, until it was everywhere at once, a low, dense mechanical roar that built and did not peak, that went on expanding until it filled the entire acoustic space of the open farmland, the way a river fills a floodplain, not with force, but with inevitability. Cora had grown up around engines. She knew combines and tractors and grain augers, and the particular scream of a PTO shaft at full RPM. She had never heard anything like this. She walked to the end of the porch and looked north. Over the crest of the hill, a quarter-mile out, the horizon turned black. Motorcycles. Not a group of motorcycles, not a column of motorcycles. A wave of them, front to front, two abreast, stretching back from the crest of the hill to a vanishing point she could not locate, because there was no vanishing point, because they were still coming, still pouring over the ridge in an unbroken flow of chrome and black leather and exhaust that caught the thin early light and threw it back in pieces. The sound was no longer something she heard. It was something she stood inside of. They turned into the Ward Farm Drive in perfect formation, two abreast filling the gravel drive, and then the front lawn, and then the harvested field to the south parking, in long aligned rows with a precision that had nothing accidental about it. The engine noise diminished in stages as bikes cut out by the hundreds, and in the intervals between those cuts, Cora could hear individual voices, the creak of leather, the snap of a kickstand finding ground. She counted until the counting became meaningless. 2,000, more than 2,000. Men in red and white patches filling every inch of the Ward farm from the road to the barn, their breath coming up in pale columns in the cold morning air, their faces turned toward the farmhouse porch with a collective attention that was absolutely, completely silent. The Harley at the front of the column was custom longer and lower than the others, the tank finished in matte black, the chrome of it bright even in the thin morning light. It idled up to the base of the porch steps and the engine cut. The man who dismounted was built the way certain old structures are built, not large for show, but large because the function required it. 6'4", Cora estimated, with a silver beard that had been growing for decades and arms covered to the wrist in the layered ink of a life's worth of marking. His leather cut was different from the others in one specific way. The patch over his left breast read, "President," in letters that were worn and certain. He climbed the porch steps. He was looking at Cora. The screen door opened behind her, and Vera Calloway walked out onto the porch, still composed, still unhurried, as though she had simply gotten up from a nap and come to check on the weather. "You took your time," she said. The man Colt Calloway, who the people who mattered called Church, looked at his mother for one long moment, and something moved across his face that was too controlled and too private to name. Then he turned back to Cora. He studied her the way his mother had studied her in the ditch, not with the casual assessment of someone sizing up a stranger, but with the focused attention of someone who is trying to understand what they are looking at. "You're the one who pulled her out," he said. His voice was deep and abraded like gravel under a slow wheel. Cora held his eyes. "Yes." Colt Calloway, president of the Midwest faction of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. A man who had stood in rooms where the wrong answer meant something permanent and irreversible, descended to one knee on the weathered boards of the Ward farm porch. He bowed his head. "My mother is everything," he said quietly. He looked up at Cora from the ground. "And you just saved her life. From this day until the end of your days, the Hells Angels owe you a debt that cannot be repaid." He rose. He turned his enormous frame to the 2,000 men filling every inch of the Ward farm, and when he spoke, his voice carried across the flat October fields, without effort, without strain, reaching the farthest rows of parked bikes, the way sound carries across still water. "Brothers," Colt said, "we have a cartel problem in this county." The silence of 2,000 men held for one more second, Nobody goes home until it's solved. Within 2 hours, the Ward farm had become something that had no name in Mahaska County's history. The transformation was not chaotic. That was the first thing Cora noticed standing on the porch with a cup of coffee that had gone cold in her hands watching it happen. She had expected something raw, something that matched the volume and the leather and the sheer physical mass of 2,000 men occupying a piece of ground. What she got instead was precision. Supply trucks materialized from the county road before the last bikes had finished parking. 3 of them heavy-duty cargo rigs that pulled into the harvested field south of the barn and dropped their tailgates with the practiced efficiency of a logistics operation that had done this before. Industrial coffee urns, cases of bottled water, fuel canisters for the bikes, nothing that burdened the farm, nothing that required anything from Harlan Ward except the use of his ground. Sentries went out without being told. Cora watched them move 2-man teams walking the fence lines and the access roads with the unhurried alertness of men who had learned to watch ground the way farmers learn to watch weather. By 6:30, there was a perimeter around the Ward property that no vehicle could approach without being seen from 2 directions at a minimum. Harlan stood beside his daughter on the porch and watched all of this and said nothing for a long time. "Gulf War," he finally said. Cora looked at him. "The logistics," he said. "The perimeter setup. The way they divided without being told." He took a slow sip of his own coffee. "These men have done this before." "I know," Cora said. "I'm not saying that like it's a bad thing," Harlan said. "I'm saying it like it's a fact." Inside the farmhouse, Vera Calloway had washed her face and accepted a clean flannel shirt from the stack in the hallway closet and was sitting at the kitchen table with her 3rd cup of coffee in the stillness of someone conserving energy for what came next. The cut on her cheekbone had closed and darkened into a bruise that she had not looked at in any mirror and did not appear to be thinking about. Colt came through the back door at 6:45 with 2 men behind him. The first was Slade Harwick, the vice president of the Chicago chapter, a man built along the lines of a load-bearing wall, not tall but wide and dense with a scar that ran from the corner of his left eye to the hinge of his jaw that he had apparently stopped noticing sometime in the last decade. He moved through the kitchen doorway and took a position against the far wall with the automatic efficiency of someone who always identified the wall first. The second was Rook Dennison. Cora put him at somewhere over 6 feet and somewhere under a readable expression. He had the enforcer's gift for presence. Without performance, he didn't need to project anything, because the fact of him was already sufficient. He stood to Colt's left and slightly behind, and he looked at everything in the room once, and then he looked at nothing in particular, which Cora understood meant he was looking at all of it. Colt unfolded a topographic map of Mahaska County across the kitchen table, smoothing it flat with both hands. He anchored the corners with a coffee mug, a salt shaker, and the flats of his fists. "Talk to me about the car," he said. He was looking at Cora, not at Vera, not at Harlan, at Cora. She set down her cold coffee and came to the table. "Late model Lincoln Town Car," she said. "Dark blue, front right tire blue. They'd been driving hard on it for a while. The sidewall was already showing stress when they went into the ditch. I could see the split from where I was standing." She paused. "But that's not the thing." Colt waited. "The tires," she said. "When I went down into the ditch after the tall one, the second man, the one I tackled, I was close to the rear wheels of the car. The treads were packed with red clay, dense and wet like it hadn't dried yet." She put her finger on the map. "I've been working this land my entire life. I've driven every county road in a 20-mile radius behind a tractor or an ATV. The soil in this part of Iowa is black topsoil over gray clay subsoil. Gray, not red." Slade Harwick uncrossed his arms. "How far does that go?" "Every direction," Cora said. "North, south, east, west. Black top, gray sub. That's what this county is made of." She moved her finger north on the map toward the upper edge of Mahaska County, where the county line met the ridge. There is one place within 40 miles that has a red clay deposit. One, it's an old limestone quarry on the northern county line. They dug it out in the 60s and 70s, hit a red clay seam about 30 feet down, and shut the whole operation in the early 90s when the economics stopped working. The pit's been sitting empty for 15 years. She tapped the spot on the map. The access roads are washed out. You can't find them on any GPS system because they were logging trails before the quarry was built, and they were never officially mapped. Nobody goes up there. She looked up from the map. Nobody except the family that owns the deed. The kitchen was quiet. Colt looked at the map for a long moment without speaking. "Whose land?" he said. Harlan answered from the corner of the kitchen, and his voice had a quality that Cora had only heard from him a few times, the voice he used when something had confirmed a thing he had been hoping was not true. "The Pruitt family," Harlan said. "Sheriff Denton Pruitt's family has held that deed for 30 years. Denton's father bought it when the quarry went under. Denton inherited it when his father passed." He stopped. "Denton oversees the property. His brother lives in a care facility down in Des Moines. Nobody else goes near it." Colt looked up from the map. He looked at Harlan the way you looked at a man who had just told you something that cost him something to say. "You know this man," Colt said. 22 years, Harlan said. "We were in the same hunting camp for 12 of them. I was at his wedding." He paused. "He came to Margaret's funeral. That's my wife. 4 years ago." Nobody said anything. Vera, from her chair at the end of the table, looked at her son. Something passed between them that required no words and had the quality of a conversation that had happened so many times in so many kitchens that it had refined itself down to a glance. Colt straightened up from the map. He was not angry. That was the thing that Cora kept coming back to as she watched him, because anger would have been understandable, and anger would have been readable, and anger was not what was in the room. What was in the room was something colder and more deliberate than anger, something that had been through anger enough times that it knew anger was a luxury and had learned to operate without it. "He sold you out," Colt said to his mother. Not as a question. "He sold someone out," Vera said. "Whether it was me specifically or the route information generally, the result was the same." She set down her coffee cup. "I told you not to trust local law." "You told me years ago," Colt said. "I tell you every time," she said. Colt looked back at the map. His jaw worked once a small and private motion, and then the stillness returned. He looked at Cora. "You said the access roads aren't on any GPS. "They're not," she said. "And you know them." "I've been running that ridge on an ATV since I was 14, she said. "Checking fence line. There are 3 approaches from the south and east that would bring you to the rim of the quarry without using any mapped road. All of them are tight for bikes, but passable if you're careful. None of them have line of sight to the quarry floor until you're at the rim." Colt nodded slow and once. "Then you're guiding us," he said. Harlan Ward moved from the corner of the kitchen to the table in 2 steps. "No," he said. His voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. It had the weight of a man who had made certain kinds of decisions before and understood what they cost and was not willing to pay this particular cost without being heard. Colt looked at him. "She's 19 years old," Harlan said. "She's already done more than anyone had a right to ask. She pulled your mother out of a ditch with a pipe wrench in her bare hands, and she brought her safe to this house. That is enough. That is more than enough." He held Colt's eyes. "You want a guide, I'll go. I know that ridge. Maybe not the way she does, but I know it well enough." Colt looked at him for a long moment. "You're a good father," he said. It was not a deflection. He meant it. Then he looked at Cora, and Cora looked at her father. She had spent her whole life reading Harlan Ward, reading the set of his shoulders and the quality of his silence, and the way he held his hands when he was afraid for her versus when he was afraid in general. She knew what she was looking at right now. She knew the shape of it and the weight of it and how much it had cost him to say what he had just said in front of these men. She also knew something else. "You said it on the porch," she said to Colt. "You owe a debt." I did, Colt said. Then I'm naming my price. She held his eyes without flinching, without apology. I finish this. I guide you to the quarry, and I see it through to the end. Whatever the end is. She paused. That's what I want. Colt looked at her for a long time. Then he said, get your boots on. Harlan Ward stood at the kitchen door and watched his daughter walk to the back hall and pull on her work boots and her canvas jacket, and he did not say anything else because there was nothing else to say that would change anything, and he had raised her well enough to know that changing things was not always the point. Sometimes the point was witnessing. Sometimes the point was simply being the person who stood at the door and kept their eyes open. Cora came back through the kitchen and stopped in front of him. She didn't say anything. She put her hand on his forearm for a moment, the canvas jacket sleeve, the specific weight of his arm beneath it, and then she went out the back door. Harlan watched her go. Vera Calloway, still at the kitchen table, looked at Harlan Ward with an expression that was not pity and was not exactly sympathy, but was something adjacent to both the expression of a woman who had watched her own son walk through enough doors to understand what it felt like to be the one left standing at them. She knows what she's doing, Vera said. I know she does, Harlan said. That's not the part that worries me. Vera looked at him for a moment longer. No, she said quietly, it never is. Before Colt moved toward the assembled strike team, he stepped away from the table and made a phone call of his own. 30 seconds, a number dialed from memory, a location given in precise terms, a single sentence delivered without preamble. We found your shipment, northern Mahaska County, the old limestone quarry on the county line. Then he put the phone away and walked out the back door without explaining who he had called, and Cora filed that away and didn't ask. Because she was already beginning to understand that certain things in Colt Calloway's world were handled in the same way her father had always handled the most serious problems, quietly in advance, before anyone else knew the handling had begun. The strike team assembled in the harvested field south of the barn while the sun was still low and thin. 300 riders culled from the 2,000 by some internal selection process that Cora didn't observe and didn't need to. They simply appeared separating from the main body with the efficiency of a river dividing around an island forming up in the field with their bikes idling at the lowest possible register. Slade Harwick moved through them once and then they were ready. Colt pulled up alongside Cora on the big matte black Harley. The passenger position had a grab rail behind the seat that she took hold of as she swung up. You'll need to speak close, he said. Engine noise. I know, she said. If you need to stop, tap my left shoulder twice. Okay. If there's a problem up front, tap 3 times and I'll pass it back. Okay. He turned to look at her over his shoulder. In the early morning light, his face was unreadable in the way that faces were unreadable when the person wearing them had spent a long time making sure of it. You did a brave thing last night, he said. I did a necessary thing, Cora said. He held her eyes for a moment. Then he faced forward and rolled the throttle, and they moved out of the Ward farm in the pale October light, 300 bikes following in a column so disciplined it cast a single shadow. The first 2 miles were county road taken at low speed with the formation spread wide to minimize sound and spread the acoustic signature across as much distance as possible. Then Cora tapped Colt's shoulder once and pointed, and he took the turn. She indicated a gap in the roadside brush that looked like overgrowth and collapsed fence, but opened behind the tree line into a track that was just wide enough for a bike if the rider was willing to commit to the line. The logging trails were everything she had described. Narrow, overgrown at the margins, the surface alternating between hard-packed earth and soft ground that had been wet recently and still held compression. Branches came low overhead. Root systems crossed the track at angles that required patience. Cora called each obstacle with a tap and a hand gesture before it arrived, and Colt carried the information back through the formation with his own signals. And the 300 bikes moved through the dark timber at a walking pace, with their lights dark and their engines at idle, a slow column threading through the woods without sound, beyond the low muttering of engines kept deliberately below the threshold of carrying far. It took 40 minutes to cover 6 miles. At the edge of the timber where the tree line ended at the crest of the ridge that formed the northern wall of the limestone quarry, Colt cut the engine and put a foot down, and the entire formation stopped behind him in a silence that was total and immediate. Cora dismounted. She went forward to the tree line on foot, staying low, and Colt moved with her, and when they reached the last line of trees, she went down to her knees and then flat to her stomach and looked out over the rim of the quarry. Below them, carved into the limestone bedrock of northern Mahaska County, the pit opened up like a wound in the earth, a massive bowl-shaped excavation 200 yards across and 50 feet deep. Its walls sheer limestone gone pale in the flat morning light, its floor an expanse of gravel and old equipment that had not moved in 15 years. But the floor was not empty. 3 black SUVs were parked in a triangle near the center of the quarry, their engines idling, their exhaust rising in pale columns. A heavy transport truck sat against the far wall, its rear doors open, its cargo bay illuminated by the work lights strung from portable stands that bathed the entire quarry floor in a harsh halogen white. Armed men in tactical gear moved between the vehicles with the purposeful tempo of people working against a clock, transferring large canvas duffels from a secondary vehicle to the transport truck's bay. Cora counted 12, 14, 16 armed men on the floor. 2 more at the rim of the quarry's access ramp, which cut down from the eastern wall at a shallow angle, the only way in or out by vehicle. Near the hood of the lead SUV, 2 men stood together in conversation that was not going well. The first she recognized the heavy man from County Road 9, the one whose knees she had shattered with the pipe wrench. He stood on crutches now, his weight entirely on his right leg, his face tight with the controlled expression of someone who has been in continuous pain for the last several hours and is not willing to show it to the people around him. The second man was wearing a Mahaska County Sheriff's Department uniform. Even from this distance, from this angle, even in the harsh and flattening light of the portable workstands, Cora recognized the posture, the way the shoulders carried the weight of the uniform, the tilt of the head. Sheriff Denton Pruitt. He had a clipboard in his left hand. He was gesturing with it. Even without being able to hear the words, Cora could read the body language with perfect clarity, the forward lean, the pointed gesture, the controlled urgency of a man presenting an argument he needs to win quickly. And near the front bumper of the transport truck, a fourth figure sat on an upturned equipment crate with a phone in his hand, staring at a screen that showed no incoming messages, the driver Vera had described. The one who had been waiting at the pit for a signal that was never going to come, because the men who were supposed to send it were zip-tied in a drainage ditch on County Road 9. He had been waiting long enough that he had stopped waiting and started worrying, and the worry was visible even from the rim. Colt was flat on the ground beside her, his elbows planted, his eyes moving across the quarry floor with the systematic calm of a man conducting an assessment he has conducted before under worse conditions. "The ramp," he said barely above a breath. "East wall," Cora said. "Single lane. You put 20 bikes across the bottom and nothing gets out." "How many men on the rim besides those 2? "None that I can see. They're not expecting anyone to come through the timber. Because nobody knows those trails. Nobody except people who grew up checking fence line on this ridge," Cora said. Colt was quiet for a moment. His eyes moved to the transport truck, to the duffels going into the bay, to the men working the lights. "They're loading to leave," he said. "They've been loading since before we got here," Cora said. "They were waiting on a signal that wasn't coming because the men they sent to pick up Vera are in a ditch on County Road 9. When the signal didn't come, they stopped waiting and started moving. That's what I would do." He held her eyes for a moment, and something shifted in the quality of his attention, a small and specific recalibration that she felt rather than saw. "We have maybe 15 minutes before that truck is loaded," she said. Colt pulled back from the tree line. He rose to a crouch and moved back through the timber to where Slade Harwick was waiting at the head of the formation, and he spoke to him in a low-clipped sequence of sentences that lasted perhaps 30 seconds. Slade nodded once. He moved back through the formation with the same efficiency and Cora watched 300 riders make their final preparations in absolute silence. Lights being uncovered, engines primed and ready to fire, men shifting their weight and finding their footing on the uneven timber ground. She went back to Colt. "Slade takes 50 bikes down the ramp the moment the engines go," Colt said. "The rest hold the rim. 360. "The men at the rim of the ramp," Cora said. "Rook has them," Colt said. He took the matte black radio from his vest. He looked at the quarry one more time, the halogen light, the moving figures, the transport truck with its open bay, the sheriff in his tan uniform gesturing at a man who was running out of patience for his arguments. He keyed the radio. "Light them up," he said. 300 V-twin engines ignited simultaneously. The sound did not build. It arrived all at once, and from every direction, a wall of mechanical thunder that struck the limestone walls of the quarry and ricocheted and multiplied, doubling back on itself in the confined bowl of the pit, until it was not a sound anymore but a physical force, a pressure wave that Cora felt in her chest and her back teeth, and the fillings in her molars. On the quarry floor, the effect was instantaneous and total. The men loading the transport truck stopped moving. The armed guards turned. The two figures at the SUV, the man on crutches and the man with the clipboard, both looked up at the rim of the quarry in the same moment, and what they saw up there was the rim itself disappearing behind a solid wall of high-beam headlights that snapped on in a single synchronized flash, 300 of them, turning the quarry from a halogen-lit worksite into something that resembled the inside of a stadium when every light comes on at once. The men on the floor could not see past the lights. They could not see the riders. They could see only the light itself, brilliant and total, and coming from every point of the compass above them. Colt walked to the top of the access ramp. He started down it. He walked slowly, his boots finding the gravel with a deliberateness that was not about caution, but about communication. This is not a man who is hurrying, and the reason he is not hurrying is that he does not need to. Behind him, Slade Harwick led 50 bikes down the ramp in a column that blocked the exit as thoroughly and finally as a door being closed and bolted. Below the cartel, men looked at their rifles, and then at the rim, and then at each other. The rifles went down, not thrown, not dropped in panic, set down with the controlled and deliberate motion of men who have made a professional calculation and arrived at the only rational conclusion. The armed guards knelt. The men at the transport truck stepped away from the bay with their hands visible. Colt walked across the quarry floor through the halogen light with the stride of a man walking through a room in his own house. He walked past the cartel men without looking at them. He walked past the transport truck. He walked to the lead SUV where the man on crutches stood and where Sheriff Denton Pruitt stood with his clipboard at his side and his face the color of old limestone and his body doing something that was not quite standing and not quite collapsing, but was suspended between the two by some diminishing act of will. "Sheriff," Colt said. Pruitt's mouth moved. No sound came out immediately. "I understand you have a problem with missing persons in your county," Colt said. "Calloway." Pruitt's voice came out of him like something being dredged. "Listen to me. The cartel approached my family. They had information on my brother, on his finances, things that would have. They made it clear that if I didn't cooperate, my brother's facility, his care, everything." "You gave them her route," Colt said. "Her timetable, her specific itinerary for a private visit to a cemetery." His voice carried nothing that could be called anger. It carried something flatter and more final than anger. "My mother was on her knees in the gravel on a county road in Iowa because a man she had no quarrel with decided that his circumstances mattered more than her life." Pruitt said nothing. "A 19-year-old farm girl pulled her out of a car trunk," Colt said, "with a pipe wrench." The quarry was so quiet that Cora, still at the top of the ramp, could hear gravel shifting under someone's boot on the floor below. Colt looked at Pruitt for a long moment. Then Pruitt said a name. He said it quietly, the way men said things they couldn't unsay. And the name landed in the cold quarry air and stayed there, a state official, a name that had weight behind it. The name of a man who had been providing cover for the quarry operation through back channels for longer than anyone standing in the pit that morning had realized. Colt didn't write it down. He didn't need to. He looked at Slade Harwick, who was standing 8 feet away, and Slade gave one small nod that meant the name had been received and filed in the only ledger that mattered. Then Colt stepped back and looked at Rook Dennison, who had materialized at some point in the last 60 seconds at a position slightly behind and to the left of the sheriff. "Tie them to the rock crusher," Colt said. "All of them. Leave the sheriff with his friends." He turned to the cartel boss, the one with the gold chain, and the expression of a man reassessing a series of recent decisions. "You came a long way from home," Colt said. "You came here to take my mother. Now you're at the bottom of a hole with 300 of her sons looking down at you." He paused. "The DA task force out of Chicago is already on their way. They are very interested in whatever is in that truck." He glanced at the transport bay. "Enjoy the federal system." The cartel man said nothing. Cora watched from the rim as Rook and 4 others moved through the quarry floor with practiced efficiency, securing the prisoners to the rusted steel frame of the old rock crusher with the kind of knots that communicated finality. The driver who had been waiting for his signal, the one Vera had heard mentioned in the car, the one who had been sitting on that equipment crate staring at an unanswered phone, was already zip-tied to the front bumper of the transport truck. By the time Rook reached him, his phone on the gravel beside him, the screen still showing an outgoing call that had never connected. The sheriff stood with his wrists behind his back and his eyes on the gravel and his clipboard still somehow in his hand until Rook took it away from him with the expression of a man removing something from someone who had forfeited the right to hold it. Then Colt was back at the ramp, coming up it the same way he had gone down. Unhurried, his boots finding the gravel with the same deliberateness as the descent. He reached the top and stood beside Cora. In the far distance, coming from the south along the county roads, the first thin wail of sirens had begun. "Time to go," he said. He looked at her, and what was in his face in that moment was not the expression she had expected. It was something quieter, something that had the shape of a man looking at something he had not anticipated finding in a place like this. Cora looked at him. "There's one more thing," she said. "I know," Colt said. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to, because at that moment from the far side of the quarry access ramp came the sound of a single engine firing one of the black SUVs. The last one, the one that had been parked farthest from the main cluster and closest to a secondary track that cut along the quarry's western wall. In the chaos of the surrender and the press of 50 bikes flooding the ramp and 300 headlights blinding the floor, someone had calculated the odds and decided that the western track, overgrown, unpromising, invisible to anyone who didn't know it was there, was a better bet than standing in a limestone pit with his hands up. Sheriff Denton Pruitt was behind the wheel. He had not been secured yet. In the sequence of events and the ordering of priorities, Rook had moved to the cartel men first because they were armed, and in that window of 30 seconds, Pruitt had done the math and moved. The SUV's headlights came on. The engine revved. The vehicle lurched toward the western track, throwing gravel, nosing into the narrow gap between the quarry wall and the rusted hulk of an old conveyor frame. Cora was already moving. She had known about the western track since she was 14 years old. She had ridden it on an ATV every spring when she checked the fence line on the county boundary, a narrow rutted path that ran along the base of the quarry's western wall for 200 yards before climbing a steep switchback to the ridge above. On a bike or an ATV, it was passable with care. In a full-size SUV, it was a trap. The track narrowed to less than 8 feet at the switchback, flanked on one side by a limestone wall and on the other by a 12-foot drop into the old drainage basin. A driver who didn't know that would find it out at speed in the worst possible way. Pruitt didn't know it. Cora did. She reached the ATV she had left at the timber edge, the one she had ridden through the logging trails. She fired the engine and took the ridge path west at a speed that would have frightened her in daylight, and was simply what the situation required in the dark, navigating by the same memory that had carried her through the cornrows on Tuesday night. The land remembered, and she remembered with it. The western track emerged from the quarry floor and began its climb 100 yards ahead of her. She could see the SUV's headlights bouncing as Pruitt hit the rough ground of the track, the vehicle pitching and yawing on terrain. It was not designed for losing speed with every yard. Cora came around the ridge's western shoulder on the high ground and descended the old fence line path at an angle that brought her out directly onto the switchback, the 8-foot choke point, the place where the limestone wall came to within arm's reach on the left, and the drainage basin dropped away on the right, the place that Pruitt did not know was coming. She stopped the ATV sideways across the track, cut the engine, turned on the headlights. The twin beams of the ATV flooded the narrow switchback with flat white light, and 30 seconds later, the SUV came around the bend below, and its driver found himself looking up a steep, narrow ramp at a four-wheeler parked broadside across the only exit, with a 19-year-old girl sitting on it in her mother's knit cap and her father's canvas jacket not moving. The SUV stopped. The engine idled. Cora could hear it from where she sat 20 yards up the switchback, the sound bouncing between the limestone walls on either side. She could see Pruitt's face through the windshield, in the wash of her own headlights, pale, recalculating his jaw, working through options that were resolving one by one into nothing. She sat and let him work through them. "I know every path on this ridge, Sheriff," she said. Her voice was steady in the way it had been steady in the drainage ditch, in the way it had been steady in the kitchen, in the way it was steady now, because she had discovered at some point in the last 12 hours that this was simply what her voice did when it mattered. "I've been riding this land since I was 14. There is no way out of this quarry that I haven't already been through, and there is no way through that switchback with me in it." She paused. "Turn the engine off." The idling engine ran for another 10 seconds. Then it went quiet. Pruitt's hands came off the wheel and rose slowly into the space visible through the windshield. Cora heard boots on gravel behind her Rook Dennison coming up the ridge path at a pace that suggested he had anticipated exactly this had been 30 seconds behind her the entire way. He went past her without a word, went down to the SUV, and opened the driver's door with the calm efficiency of a man completing a task. Pruitt got out. He stood in the narrow switchback with the limestone walls close on either side, and his hands still raised and his eyes on the gravel, in whatever calculation he had been running for the last 24 hours. The one that had started with the cartel's approach and run through the betrayal and the cleanup operation and the flight attempt finally complete, finally resolved, finally arrived at its only possible conclusion. Cora sat on the ATV and watched Rook walk Pruitt back down the track. Then she sat there for a moment alone in the quiet of the ridge, the ATV's engine ticking as it cooled the limestone walls pale and close on either side, the distant sound of sirens growing in the south. She looked up. Above the quarry rim, the sky had gone from the flat gray of early dawn to something with color in it, the first faint wash of blue at the eastern edge, the kind of blue that preceded full light by 30 minutes and was easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. She had been awake since before 11 the previous night. It felt in some way she couldn't quite articulate, like a very long time ago. She started the ATV and rode back to the rim. The sirens were still distant when the last bike cleared the timber. 300 engines dropped to idle the moment they hit the tree line, and then they filtered back through the logging trails in the same disciplined silence they had arrived in single file. Lights dark, the column threading through the corridors between the oak trunks with a patience that seemed almost meditative, given what had just occurred below. Cora rode at the rear with Colt watching the timber close behind them, and by the time the first set of federal headlights reached the quarry access road, there was nothing on the ridge above it but the sound of wind moving through bare branches. The Ward farm came into view as the sun cleared the eastern tree line, fully throwing long, pale light across the harvested fields and the frost-stiffened grass of the front lawn. The 2,000 bikes that had filled every inch of the property were still there, their riders standing or sitting in the same formations they had organized themselves into hours ago. And when the strike team rolled back through the farm gate, something moved through the assembled mass. Not a cheer, not a sound, but a shift in collective posture that communicated the outcome without words. Colt cut the engine at the base of the porch steps. Cora dismounted. Her legs were steady. She noticed that with a kind of detached interest, the way you notice things about your own body after an experience that might reasonably have made them unsteady. The cold had settled into her hands during the ride back, and she pressed them together as she walked up the porch steps, feeling the joints creak back to life. The front door opened before she reached it. Harlan Ward stood in the doorway in the same position he had been in when she left, or close enough to it that the difference didn't matter. He had his canvas jacket on, now the collar turned up, and his hands were in his pockets, and his face was doing the thing it did when he had been running through scenarios in his head for an extended period and had arrived at the limit of what scenarios could tell him. He looked at her. She looked at him. "It's done," she said. He exhaled, not dramatically, not with any theatrical release, but with the small, specific deflation of a man letting go of a breath he had been holding at a depth below conscious awareness. He stepped back from the door and let her in. The kitchen was warm and smelled of coffee and the close warmth of a room that has had people in it through the cold hours of a night. Vera Calloway was at the table. She looked up when Cora came in, and her eyes moved across her with the same assessing quality they had carried since the drainage ditch, reading the situation the way a doctor reads a patient efficiently and without sentiment. "Pruitt," Vera said. "Not a question." "Federal task force has him," Cora said. "Him and the cartel crew both. The driver, too. All of them." Vera nodded once, the nod of a woman receiving information she had expected and had prepared no particular reaction for, because preparing reactions was not how she operated. Colt came through this back door behind Cora. He looked at his mother across the kitchen, and she looked at him, and the conversation they had in that look was private, in the way that all the important conversations between them appeared to be private, conducted in a language that had been developed over decades of exactly this kind of situation and required no words and no witnesses. "Sit down," Vera said to her son. He sat. Harlan poured coffee. For a while, that was all there was. 4 people in a farmhouse kitchen in the morning light with coffee, with the quiet that followed the resolution of something that had not been quiet at all. Outside through the kitchen window, Cora could see the rows of parked bikes and the men between them and the supply truck still sitting in the south field. And it all had the quality of something on the edge of dissolving. A temporary city that had materialized for a specific purpose and was already beginning to feel its own impermanence. Colt drank his coffee and looked at the map still spread across the table, the one with Cora's fingerprint marking the quarry site. He looked at it the way you looked at something after the fact, not for information, but for confirmation that the information you had acted on was the information that had been there. "The name he gave us," Colt said to no one in particular. He was still looking at the map. "The official." "I heard him," Slade Harwick said from the doorway. Cora hadn't heard him come in. "You'll sit on it," Colt said. "Until it's time not to," Slade said. Colt nodded. Cora looked between them. She understood the shape of what was being said without needing the specific content of it, understood that Pruitt's confession in the quarry had produced a name that had been filed away in the kind of memory that didn't forget names, that would surface at a moment of someone else's choosing, in a context she would probably never know about. She understood that this was how certain kinds of accounting worked, not on any visible ledger, not on any timeline announced in advance. She understood that it would be handled. She drank her coffee. By 9 o'clock that morning, the first radio report came through on the small transistor set on the kitchen counter that Harlan kept tuned to the Oskaloosa AM station out of habit. The anchor's voice was controlled with the effort of someone who had been trained to sound controlled and was finding that training somewhat tested by the material. A major law enforcement operation in northern Mahaska County had resulted in the apprehension of multiple individuals connected to an organized criminal enterprise. Sheriff Denton Pruitt had been taken into federal custody pending investigation of charges, including dereliction of duty, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to facilitate criminal enterprise. A significant quantity of controlled substances had been recovered at the scene. The Mahaska County Sheriff's Department was operating under interim leadership while the investigation proceeded. The FBI and the United States Attorney's Office for the Southern District of Iowa were jointly handling the case. The anchor paused. In a related development, sources indicated that the arrests were connected to an attempted kidnapping that had occurred the previous evening on County Road 9, in which an unnamed woman had been abducted and subsequently freed by a local resident. Harlan reached over and turned the radio down. He looked at Cora. She looked at the table. Outside, the sound of the assembled bikes had begun to change, shifting from the static idle of machines at rest to the preliminary rumbling of machines preparing for movement. Individual engines turning over, riders mounting. The slow acoustic dissolution of a massive formation beginning the process of dispersing back into whatever roads and highways and far distances it had coalesced from. Colt stood up from the table. He straightened to his full height in the low-ceiling kitchen, and the room felt the adjustment, the way rooms felt adjustments made by men of his physical presence. He looked at Harlan Ward. "Your daughter saved my mother's life," he said. "I want you to understand that I don't use that word without weighing it. Saved. What would have happened without her is not something that ends well. For my mother. Potentially for a great many other things." He paused. What she did took something that most people don't have. Harlan looked at his daughter and then back at Colt. "I know what she has," he said. "She got it from her mother." Colt held the older man's eyes for a moment. "I believe that," he said. He turned to Cora. She was standing by the counter with her coffee cup, and she met his eyes the way she had been meeting them since the porch, without flinching, without apology, with the simple directness of someone who had decided at some point early in life that looking away from things was a more expensive habit than looking at them. "The debt stands," Colt said. "What I said on the porch this morning, that doesn't change with the resolution of the situation. That's permanent." "I heard you the first time," Cora said. Something passed behind his eyes, brief and unreadable. It might have been amusement. It might have been something closer to recognition. He nodded. He went to his mother. Vera Calloway stood from her chair, and her son put his arms around her, and she let him, which was a different thing than the woman who had slept composedly on the Ward family sofa while 2,000 bikers materialized in the pre-dawn dark. She was still composed. She was also, for approximately 4 seconds, simply a mother being held by her son, and Cora looked at the window and gave them those 4 seconds in private. When she looked back, Vera was already stepping back, already straightening the collar of the borrowed flannel shirt. "Thank you for the coffee," she said to Harlan, "and the shirt." "Keep the shirt," Harlan said. She looked at Cora. "You have good instincts," she said. "Trust them more than you trust the plan. The plan is always wrong by the time you need it. The instincts are what carry you through." Cora nodded. Vera looked at her for one more moment with those flat, clear eyes. Then she walked out the back door and into the yard, and the assembled men opened a corridor for her without a word, as naturally as if they had rehearsed it. Colt followed. At the door he stopped and turned back to look at Cora one last time. He didn't say anything. He just looked the way you looked at something you were cataloging for a specific kind of memory, the kind you return to. Then he put his sunglasses on and went through the door, and it closed behind him. Cora and Harlan stood in the kitchen and listened to 2,000 engines find their voices. The sound built the way it had announced itself that morning from beneath, from the ground up, a subsonic vibration that moved through the floorboards and into their chests. Then the full organized roar hit, and the coffee mugs rattled against each other on the counter, and the transistor radio skittered an inch on its shelf, and the kitchen window trembled in its old frame. And then by degrees the sound receded. It pulled back from the farm the way a tide pulled back slowly at first, then faster, then all at once the roar diminishing to a rumble, and the rumble to a hum, and the hum to a frequency that lived just below hearing. And then it was gone, and the Iowa silence came back in around the edges of it, the way silence always came back after something loud had passed through and left the air rearranged. Harlan Ward stood at the kitchen window and looked out at his farm. The fields were empty. The driveway was empty. The south field where the supply trucks had sat was empty, the grass pressed flat in long parallel lines where the tires had been already beginning to lift back toward vertical in the weak October sun. There was no trash. There were no ruts in the soft ground along the fence lines from the sentry positions. The dog's water dish had been refilled at some point during the night and sat precisely where it always sat, full and clean. 2,000 men had been here. There was almost no evidence that anything had been here at all. Harlan put his hand flat on the window glass and looked at the empty fields for a long time. Then he went and got his tools and went out to fix the screen door. The days that followed had the quality of an exhale held too long, finally released. Cora worked the farm. She finished the irrigation pump on the eastern boundary line, seated the valve assembly she had abandoned on Tuesday night, ran the system through a full test cycle, and confirmed the fault code was cleared. She serviced the combine for winter storage. She patched 2 sections of fence along the south field perimeter where the post had worked loose in the autumn rain. She did not watch the news. Harlan watched it for both of them in the evenings with the volume low, and what he relayed to her over dinner was filtered and brief because he had the veteran's economy with information and knew the difference between what needed to be said and what merely existed to fill silence. What needed to be said, Pruitt had been formally indicted on 11 federal counts. The cartel operation had been the largest single drug interdiction in Iowa state history. The state-level official whose name Pruitt had given in the quarry, whose name Cora did not know and did not ask for, had resigned from his position 4 days after the arrests, citing personal reasons. Effective immediately, no further statement. The resignation had been announced on a Friday afternoon, which was when people announced things they hoped the weekend news cycle would swallow. Cora ate her dinner and thought about that resignation and the timeline of it, in the phrase "until it's time not to," and she understood the arithmetic without needing to work it out loud. On Thursday, 2 days after the quarry, a deputy from the state police arrived at the farm and asked Cora for a statement regarding the events of Tuesday night on County Road 9. She told him what she had seen. She described the Lincoln Town Car and the 2 men and the woman in the trunk. She described the pipe wrench and the drainage ditch and the ATV ride back to the farmhouse. She did not mention 2,000 motorcycles. The deputy wrote everything down and thanked her and said she would likely be contacted by the federal prosecutor's office in the coming weeks. She said that was fine. He left. Harlan watched the cruiser go down the farm drive from the porch. "You left some things out," he said. "I told him what I saw," Cora said. Harlan thought about that. "I suppose that's true," he said. The week passed. The farm returned to its rhythms, the unhurried, relentless rhythms of agricultural life in late autumn, when the work shifted from the urgency of harvest to the slower maintenance of winterizing, and the days got shorter and the light got thinner, and the fields settled into their off-season gray. On the following Wednesday morning, exactly 1 week after the night on County Road 9, Cora was in the equipment barn replacing the hydraulic fluid in the tractor when she heard tires on the gravel drive. Not a farm truck, not the passing noise of a vehicle on the county road, the deliberate crunch of a vehicle pulling in and stopping. She wiped her hands on a shop rag and came around the side of the barn. A Mercedes-Benz sat in the farm drive. Black, current model. The kind of vehicle that had no business on a Mahaska County gravel road and knew it, and had come anyway because its business was more important than its inconvenience. The engine was off. A man was stepping out of the driver's side, not young, not old, wearing a charcoal suit that was too well fitted for the setting, and carrying a leather briefcase of the kind that communicated that its contents were the only thing in the current situation that mattered. He looked at the farmhouse and then at Cora emerging from beside the barn and adjusted his direction toward her. "I'm looking for the Ward family," he said. "You found one of us," Cora said. He looked at her for a moment with the professional assessment of a man who spent his days reading situations quickly. "Ms. Ward," he said, "I represent a private benefactor based in Cave Creek, Arizona. I have a delivery for your household. I was asked to present it in person to a member of the family directly." He set the briefcase on the hood of the Mercedes and opened it. Inside was a manila envelope thick with the Ward Farm address written on the front, in handwriting. That was not a secretary's handwriting. It was someone's own hand, the deliberate script of someone who had decided to write this themselves rather than have it written for them. He took the envelope out and handed it to Cora. She opened it. The first document was a letter on the letterhead of First Agricultural Bank of Iowa addressed to Harlan Ward. She read the first paragraph, and then she stopped and read it again because the first read didn't entirely compute. The letter confirmed the full and final satisfaction of the mortgage instrument dated 14 years prior on the Ward Farm property at its Mahaska County address. All outstanding principal, all accrued interest, all associated liens on equipment and property, satisfied in full. The accompanying deed enclosed reflected clear title in the name of Harlan R. Ward, free of all encumbrances effective the previous Friday. The second document was the deed. She held it in both hands in the October sunlight in the farm drive and looked at it for a long moment. Her father's name on it in black ink with the bank's embossed seal in the corner and the notation free and clear on the title line. "Ms. Ward," the man said, and she looked up. "There's one more item." He reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and produced something small, set it in her palm with the care of someone delivering something that had been entrusted to them with specific instructions about how it was to be given. A coin, gold or gold-finished heavy for its size. One face bore the winged skull in the same relief as the ring Vera had worn at the kitchen table, the death's head precise and absolute, every feather of the wings rendered with a care that communicated that the image mattered deeply to the people who had made it. She turned it over. The reverse was inscribed in letters that were small and even and had been put there with patience. "Blood makes you related. Loyalty makes you family." Cora stood in the drive with the coin in her palm and the deed in her other hand, and she looked at both of them for a long time. The man from Cave Creek, Arizona, was speaking something about the bank, about the transfer of funds having been completed the previous Friday, about her being welcome to contact the bank directly to confirm any of the details. She heard it the way you heard things when your attention was somewhere else entirely at a depth below the words. She was thinking about a Tuesday night 1 week ago that she had nearly not survived. She was thinking about what it had cost and what it had returned and whether those two things were in any proportion to each other. And she was arriving at the conclusion that they were not, that they had never been meant to be. That proportion was not the operating principle of the transaction that had taken place on County Road 9, and in the kitchen, and on the porch, and in the quarry, and on the limestone switchback in the dark. The operating principle was something older than proportion and less negotiable. You did the right thing because it was the right thing. And sometimes, not always, not even often, but sometimes the world sent something back. She closed her fingers around the coin. "Thank you," she said to the man. He nodded, closed his briefcase, got back in the Mercedes. She stood in the drive and watched it go back down toward the county road, and she held the deed and the coin until the sound of the engine faded into the October quiet. Then she went to find her father. Harlan was at the screen door, the one he had been working on all week in the incremental way he worked on things an hour here, an hour there, fitting the repair into the margins of the other work. He had the frame propped against the porch rail and the new screen material stretched across it, and he was running a roller along the spline channel with the focused attention of a man who was doing one thing and thinking about several others. He looked up when Cora came around the side of the house. She held out the deed. He looked at it without taking it for a moment. Then he set the roller down on the porch rail and took the deed in both hands and read the first paragraph. She watched his face. Harlan Ward had not cried at his wife's funeral. He had stood at the grave in the November cold, with his jaw set and his hands at his sides and his eyes dry, and Cora had watched him do it, and had understood that this was not the absence of grief, but a different way of carrying it. One that had its roots in the year he had spent in the Gulf and the education that year had provided about the relationship between what you felt and what you showed. He did not cry now either, but something moved across his face that was large and quiet and had the quality of a deep tectonic reorganization, something that had been under pressure for so long that its release was less dramatic than simply inevitable. The way a fault line settles not with catastrophe, but with a slow, decisive shift that changes the shape of the ground above it forever. He lowered the deed. He looked out across the fields, The harvested acres, the fence lines, the distant tree line where the timber began the wide and ordinary October sky. Free and clear, he said. Free and clear, Cora said. He was quiet for a long time. Your mother always said this land would outlast the debt, he said. I told her she was an optimist. She told me I was confusing optimism with arithmetic. He paused. She was right about a lot of things. She was, Cora said. He looked at the coin she was still holding. She held it out to him. He took it, turned it over, read the inscription. He read it twice. Then he turned it back to the death's head and looked at the raised relief of the winged skull with the expression of a man reconsidering several categories of judgment he had carried for some years. I spent a long time thinking I understood what loyalty meant, he said. The military version of it. The institutional version where it has a chain of command and a set of regulations behind it. He looked at the coin. This is something else. I know, Cora said. He handed the coin back to her. Keep it, he said. She took it. That afternoon, the last afternoon of October, with the sun going sideways and orange across the western fields, the way it did at this time of year, the way it had been doing her entire life, the way it would keep doing long after her Cora walked out into the fields alone. Not to work. There was work to do. There was always work to do on a 500-acre farm in the last days before winter. But she left it where it was, and she walked out past the equipment barn and through the gate in the south fence and into the open ground of the harvested field where the corn stubble crunched under her boots and the cold air moved in slow, steady currents that smelled of turned earth and dry stalks and the mineral edge that Iowa fields carried in late autumn. She walked until she was in the middle of it, until the farmhouse was a white shape in the distance, and the barn was a red rectangle, and the tree lines were dark margins on every horizon, and there was nothing immediately around her but the open sky and the harvested ground and the wind. She stopped. She put her hand in her jacket pocket and closed it around the coin. She stood there for a while. She thought about the woman in the trunk and the pipe wrench and the drainage ditch and the darkness in the corn. She thought about the porch and the 2,000 bikes and Colt on one knee on the weathered boards. She thought about the quarry and the halogen light and Pruitt with his clipboard and the moment she had come around the ridge's western shoulder on the ATV and dropped into the switchback and turned on the headlights and sat still and waited. And the SUV had come around the bend below and stopped, and she had said what she said and found that her voice was exactly what it needed to be. She thought about her mother's knit cap and the smell of the cedar closet. She thought about what Vera Calloway had said in the kitchen. Trust your instincts more than you trust the plan. The plan is always wrong by the time you need it. The instincts are what carry you through. She thought about what it meant that a woman who had lived the life Vera Calloway had lived had looked at a 19-year-old farm girl from Mahaska County, Iowa, and said that. The wind moved through the stubble around her feet with the low papery hiss of dry things in cold air. And the sound was the same sound the corn had made on Tuesday night when she had been standing at the pump and the world had broken open. And she understood that the sound had not changed, and the field had not changed, and the sky had not changed. What had changed was smaller and more interior than any of those things, and was still in the process of becoming whatever it was going to be. She opened her hand and looked at the coin. The death's head looked back. She was 19 years old and she had not done anything heroic. She was clear about that in the way she was clear about things that mattered to her. She had done what was in front of her to do with what she had in the time that was available. That was all. That was the entirety of it. The pipe wrench and the dark and the drainage ditch and the choice that wasn't really a choice, because not choosing was also a choice. And she had understood that the moment she saw the heavy man's hand come down across the silver-haired woman's face and watched her go down onto the gravel. You did not look away from that. You did not calculate your odds and decide they were unfavorable and go back to your irrigation pump. Not if you were the person she intended to be. Not if you were Cora Ward, who had grown up on this land and learned from it the same thing. The land itself kept demonstrating season after season through drought and frost and thin years and the relentless compounding of debt that what endured was not what was strongest at the start, but what refused when the moment came to look away. She closed her fingers around the coin again and looked out across the field to where the farmhouse sat against the October sky, and she could see her father on the porch, a small figure in the distance, and he was looking out across the fields in her direction. She knew he could see her, a small figure in the middle of the harvested ground, just standing there, which was something he understood because he had done it himself in various fields on various afternoons in the years since her mother died, and she had watched him do it from the porch and understood that some things needed to be processed out in the open, under the sky, with the ground under your feet and the wind moving and nothing between you and the horizon. He raised one hand, she raised hers back. The sun went a degree lower and the light shifted from orange to the deeper amber of the last minutes before it dropped behind the tree line, and the shadows of the corn stubble stretched long and thin across the ground, and the wind kept moving through the dry stalks with its low papery sound, and the coin was warm now in her closed hand, warmed by her own skin, carrying the raised image of the winged skull on one face and the inscription on the other. Blood makes you related. Loyalty makes you family. She held it, and she stood in the field of her family's land, free and clear after 14 years, free and clear at last, and she breathed the cold air of Mahaska County, Iowa, and she was exactly where she had always been. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough.